My project was in collaboration with the Danish National Archives, and they've been conducting the country's longest running crowdsourcing project. It's been started since 1992. And I was brought in because they didn't have so much information about the volunteers who were involved with their crowdsourcing. They wanted to get a little bit more information about their practices and processes and what exactly it meant to be a volunteer at the National Archives. The crowdsourcing project was basically started because a number of amateur historians and genealogists were interested in making the records that they were already working with available to other people. So they wanted to make them available to other historians, other researchers in an academic context, as well as the general public and other genealogists. So it was really a sort of ground up project that the genealogists who were already doing a lot of this work started to initiate interest in making everything digitally available. And so they really gathered together a number of resources, a number of people, and in collaboration with the Danish National Archives, they then developed the crowdsourcing database, which is the Danish demographic database. And then that led several years on to a more formal crowdsourcing portal, which is simply called Crowdsourcing Portal. And that was started in, I believe, 2004, in order to really organize and compile a lot of the digital information that the crowdsourcing volunteers were working with.
You weren't involved in the project in its initial stages, but do you know how the project recruited their participants, their citizen scientists?
Yeah, it was. I believe it was really quite a snowball effect that this particular group of amateur historians and genealogists were quite showed a lot of interest in making sure that these records were digitally input into the computer systems. So they had a good relationship with the employees and the people who were in charge of the organization at the Danish National Archives. So they really initiated the project on their own volition, you could say. So they started organizing it in a very informal way, and then the process became a lot more organized as the years went on. So there were developed a number of different templates and a number of different platforms that the volunteers could put this information into the computer system and digitalize everything. So this was both the photography and the actual information from the archival material. But so it was really the volunteers themselves who initiated it, and they, through their own genealogical networks, also recruited additional volunteers. So it's really been a process of outreach from the ground level, you could say, among the volunteers, among the genealogical researchers themselves, that's only been organized in the last few years in a more formal way through this crowdsourcing portal. So there are employees at the Danish National Archives who are responsible for recruiting and retaining the volunteers they have. And there are several different ways that they do that, mainly through social media. They have a Facebook page, and also through a lot of the different events that they host at the various locations of the National Archives.
What kind of unexpected outcomes did you find in your own research in terms of the participants' feelings towards this project?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. My background as an ethnologist is looking at cultural processes and how people have certain practices in their everyday lives that may impact culture and how culture impacts practices. I was interested in looking at how those particular practices might not necessarily conform exactly to what the Danish National Archives was expecting from their work. So, in other words, are there certain challenges that the volunteers experience when they're doing this type of work? And I conducted this short project to look at their experiences and look at their perspectives on doing this type of digitalization. And I found that it was really interesting because they were incredibly motivated. They were incredibly invested in the outcome of this work. But because we're humans and the volunteers are humans, they don't necessarily conform to a particular template. And they often make little interpretations of the material in a certain way. So even though the National Archives will tell them you can only put in a name exactly as it's written, even if there's a misspelling, you have to capture the exact name as it's written. The volunteers might say, well, I know that this person is called Peterson, and I'm going to spell it the correct way because I know from my other research that there might be a connection to this other Peterson. So there's this process of adaptation that takes place and interpretation. And that, of course, is part of historical research, that everybody gets involved, and there may be interpretations of a date or a place or a practice in a death certificate. So something is written specifically, and the volunteer, because they know from their other research, well, this isn't quite right, they may make a certain adaptation. So I think that was really interesting to find out through the project. And I think it just goes to show how engaged they are and how interested they are in making sure that things are easier for future researchers who come in and search for records.
And the volunteers themselves, were you aware of any expectations that they might have had before they joined the project? And do you know if they changed or if they realized those expectations whilst doing this work?
I think the volunteers expected that they could come into the crowdsourcing project. I'm thinking specifically of the people who are transcribing the records at this point. And I think they had an expectation that they could come in and just easily find a name or a birthplace or a death certificate, all of the information that's involved in those records, and that it would go into this online template. And what I think was a particular challenge for them was actually reading some of the historical documentation, because so much of, in Denmark, so much of the handwriting from the 1700s, 1800s is in this very specific kind of Germanic text and a Germanic handwriting. The Danish National Archives actually offers courses for the volunteers in reading this very specific kind of handwriting so that they can more easily go through the records. So I think that was really interesting for them to realize that, oh, it's not exactly the language that we use in our current day-to-day Danish. It's actually a very specific form of not only handwriting, but a way of forming sentences and a way of forming the information. So it's very specific to that historical time.
What was the demographic of the people that volunteered to take part in this project?
Yeah, one of the reasons I was brought into the project is because I have expertise with working with older citizens. The demographic profile of these volunteers is that most of them are over age 65. They're retired from their work. Some of the people who I talked to were involved in some consulting or some part-time work, but most of them had already gone on pension and were just interested in volunteering because they had a little bit more free time. In my particular study, I was interested in speaking to a range of different people from all sorts of backgrounds. I was only able, because my project was a short-term project, I was only able to primarily speak to people who were working and volunteering at the office in Copenhagen. The Danish National Archives has several locations around Denmark. And I was unable, with time constraints, to go out to some of these other offices. But I did speak to the volunteers in Copenhagen and Odense, which are the two primary offices. And all of them are retired people. All of them have a variety of different backgrounds in terms of academic experience. Some of them have PhDs, some of them have just gone to trade school. They had a variety of different careers in their previous working lives. So some of them had been school teachers, some of them had been IT specialists. So they really, I think, reflected a broad range of characteristics in terms of representing the Danish population, you could say. And I spoke to a mix of men and women who were involved with the different volunteer functions that the Danish National Archives offers. So I think in terms of the profile of the volunteers, it was a wide range of the different tasks that they have. They were varied in terms of their gender, but in terms of their age profile, they were all over 65.
Did you speak to any of the project leads at the Danish National Archive about their experiences of this crowdsourcing project?
Yes, I had fairly close contact throughout the short project that I conducted with the woman who's directly responsible for organizing all of the crowdsourcing activities. So she was the one who helped me get access to the volunteers initially, make contact with them, and she made introductions of me and my project so that the volunteers knew exactly what I was looking for and what I was hoping to find out with this particular project. So she was really my key gatekeeper in terms of providing access. And there were several other people, historians who I have contact with and who I knew in advance, who helped me get into the project initially. So I had a lot of good contact with the people directly responsible for the crowdsourcing initiative at the archives, and they provided me with a lot of insight in terms of the background and in terms of their expectations for the project.
And what was their overall feeling about the crowdsourcing project once it had been finished?
Well, the crowdsourcing project is ongoing, so there is no lack of historical records that still need to be digitalized. So there's no end in sight, really. The volunteers put in about nearly 1 million records per year, and there's still only up to, I think, the 18th century.
Goodness me.
Yeah, and Denmark, as you know, is an extremely small country, so it's quite impressive that there even exists so many records. They have records that are not only birth and death certificates, but all of the church records, and there were thousands and millions of church records, especially in earlier times when most people were attending church on a regular basis. Plus, they have a lot of war records, things having to do with the Danish West Indies in historical times. So there's quite a lot of a variation. There's quite a large variation of historical material that needs to be digitalized.
What did the participants gain from taking part in this crowdsourcing project?
For the volunteers themselves, they feel a real obligation, not only to the Danish National Archives, because they've collected all of these materials for as long as they have and have allowed access to the general public to use these records and to do research with these records. But the volunteers also feel a very strong sense of obligation to future generations of researchers. So for them, what they get out of it is this sense of connection with all of the researchers and genealogists who have come before them, and a sense of connection to the people who will come after them and who they're helping to make these records available. So it's really a sense of pride that they have in being part of the whole process. It's not just, well, I've photographed this one record, or I've transcribed the information from this one record. It's really, I'm part of this whole community of people who are engaged with historical research, who are engaged with digital humanities. And for them, it's really very life-affirming in a lot of ways. And I think, again, because my background is in health and aging studies, we can look at this as being really important to older volunteers' quality of life. So they're getting a sense of community, they're getting a sense of connection with not only people, other researchers from the past, but also other researchers in the future. And they have a particular engagement with the actual people represented in the historical records. So all of these factors, I think, are directly related to helping them feel a sense of community and connection with the people that are implied in a lot of these records. So this whole project is really affirming for them and really helps keep them engaged in a particular way. So I think they would say that the benefit that they get is feeling part of this whole process.
finally, I think having conducted your own research into the volunteers and the practices there, what do you think works in a crowdsourcing project like this, and what doesn't necessarily work quite so well?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think one of the most important things in terms of retaining volunteers for the transcription in particular is to make sure they have the support that they need, and to make sure that they feel recognized and appreciated for their efforts. And I think in terms of the project that I conducted, where I was specifically talking to all sorts of different volunteers, the counselors, the photographers, and the transcriptionists, about their experiences doing the digitalization of the historical material, working with members of the public, helping to develop the research involved with digital humanities. I think it was important for them to feel like their contributions have made a difference, and that for me, coming in as a qualitative researcher, asking them about their experiences was also another form of acknowledgement for the work that they're doing. They feel, the people who I spoke with feel a strong sense of obligation, as I mentioned before, and they don't necessarily think about it in terms of, well, this is something special that I'm doing. They just feel, well, I'm interested in genealogy. This is helping other people. This is important to me. But I think it's important in terms of recruiting and retaining future volunteers for crowdsourcing projects to acknowledge that they have a human value, that they have their own lives that go beyond these projects, that they may have health problems, they may have problems in their relationships with their children or grandchildren, that they have all sorts of different issues that could impact how much they're able to produce in terms of output of the digital records. So for any organization that's looking to recruit new volunteers for crowdsourcing projects, I think it's really important for them to recognize the fact that people have their lives, and that it is a real gift of people's time and efforts and energy to get involved with these projects. So it's important to have a good structure in place. It's important to have some sort of organized process in terms of what the expectations are, what materials are available for crowdsourcing, and what the expectations are. And once those things are clear, to make sure that there's an open dialogue that's very iterative to hear the volunteers' concerns and problems, so that the process becomes smoother for everybody involved. And as the project develops over time, to keep that pipeline open, to make sure that the expectations are still clear and that everybody is satisfied with what's taking place.
Amy Clotworthy is an independent researcher at the Danish National Archives. She was interviewed by Vicky Garnett as part of the PARTHENOS Project Training Materials. PARTHENOS is an EU Horizon 2020 funded project.